Welcome to My Therapist is Out. Each episode, we talk with a therapist from Open Space Therapy Collective or LGBT community members about mental health and building community. I'm your host, Renae Johnson, licensed therapist and founder of Open Space Therapy Collective, where we are your hub for queer and trans mental health care. Today's episode is sponsored by the Live Beyond ACEs and Toxic Stress Awareness campaign developed by the Office of the California Surgeon General. To find out more about ACEs, visit their website at livebeyondca.org or on social media at livebeyondca. A special thank you to our guests and the Live Beyond team for their sponsorship of this episode.
As we dive into today's topic, please keep in mind that this is a mental health podcast. We will talk about sensitive and difficult issues that are not appropriate for all audiences. Please take care while listening.
Hey y'all, welcome back. This episode is really special. It's the first time that we have two guests, and they are with the Live Beyond campaign, which is a campaign that's helping promote awareness and recovery resources for adverse childhood experiences. We use the term ACEs a lot throughout the interview. And I just got out of the interview about an hour ago, and I'm still just really moved. My heart is just deeply impacted by this conversation. We have Dr. John Blosnich with us, who is a professor at USC who specializes in studying the LGBT community and suicide, and sits on the advisory board for the Live Beyond campaign. And then we also have youth advocate Juniper Brown, who really talks about his experience as somebody who experienced ACEs and is working to grow beyond that. John uses he, him pronouns. Juniper uses he, they pronouns. You'll hear that referenced and how that's impacted their growth and their healing. But let me know what you think. This really affects all of us in different ways, in the ways that our childhood upbringing affects us, the environments that we're in, the people's attitudes that we're around. It really hit home for me, so I hope it does for you too. If you want more information about ACEs, you can go to livebeyond.org. There's tons of resources. They've done a beautiful job with not just the website design, but all of the resources and ways to access care. And of course, DM, message, share this with somebody who you think it'd impact. Also, please follow, rate us on the podcast streamers. It's insanely helpful. And let's dive into this really special conversation with Juniper and John. Welcome to My Therapist is Out, an Open Space Therapy Collective podcast. We have a really unique episode this week. We are talking about adverse childhood experiences and the Live Beyond campaign. And we have two experts with us today that have been working with the campaign. The first of which is Dr. John Blosnich, he, him, who is a professor with USC, and youth advocate Juniper Brown, he, they. And I am so excited to dive into this today. Thank you for being here.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. For those of you, or for those of our audience who haven't met you yet, can you introduce yourselves a little bit? Either one can go first.
Thank you, Juniper. So I am an associate professor in the School of Social Work at USC, although I'm not a social worker. Most of my training is in public health. So I, use a lot of data and information from surveys, from health records to try to understand, pressing public health issues, including adverse childhood experiences or ACEs.
Awesome.
I'm Juniper Brown. I use he, they pronouns, and I'm a gender nonconforming transgender man. I'm a queer advocate, especially locally in the Bay Area. Another fun factoid about me is that I'm a KV enthusiast, and those are rodents from the South American animal family, Cavidae. And I'm also a really proud martial artist. I practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and it has a deep connection to my queerness and self-defense and my personality as a whole.
Cool. I am really excited to talk more about both of those things as we dive in. I was doing some research about both of you last night, and the second the jujitsu stuff started coming out, I was like, oh, this is going to be fun. So can you guys tell us a little bit more about what ACEs is? Because it's not really talked about very much. And so I'd like to hear from both of you. Again, either can go first about your experience of it, how you understand it, and how you kind of see it in your life or with the people that you work with.
Would you like to go first?
Sure. So I can talk about it from, I guess, more of the kind of the research that we do to understand it. Because just like you said, it is not a topic that comes up often. It's a topic that people don't like to broach for obvious reasons. These are unfortunately negative situations and experiences that people can have. They can be potentially traumatic. So in the research literature, the most common way that we've tried to gather this type of information as sensitively as we can is through what's called an ACEs inventory. It is not comprehensive. This was started actually in California over 20 years ago, 25, maybe 30 years ago, to try to understand the contextual factors that can impact someone's health and their behaviors. And so ACEs typically includes, from a research perspective, getting information about people, about events that have happened prior to the age of 18. And they include things like, living with someone who had a mental illness, such as depression, or maybe someone who was potentially suicidal at some point in time, living with someone who was formerly incarcerated, down to what we think about more typically of ACEs, such as emotional abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you're outlining kind of the spectrum of what this can be, is the really intense abuse that people can experience to having a parent with depression. Because a lot of times these things get brushed off, or people brush off their experiences when they're not big and bad and you don't see them in a movie. Juniper, for you, how did you come to understand ACEs and learn about ACEs?
I was first introduced to the term ACEs by a therapist that I got when I was about 14. Previously to that, I had been through a sort of domestic abuse situation, and I was in a really dark place. And I was introduced to this term. And for me, it was a way to address these things that I had experienced throughout my life that led to this situation, without compartmentalizing it, without the drama, without the flair. Oftentimes when you say trauma, people picture a very specific image in their head. And when it doesn't align with that image, they don't afford you the validity that you deserve. And so with this term and with the research around it, I could really identify with these things that happen and understand that. And it was really beneficial for me in my recovery.
That's awesome. It's so important to find that validation that what you're experiencing is real, and people are there to support you, and finding ways to understand it more deeply is really that entry path into healing and growth and change. That's amazing. Can you talk about, either academically or from your lived experience, the ranges of things that affected you or affect people that would be under the ACEs umbrella? Like domestic abuse is a big one. What are some other things that have played into the ACEs experience?
For me, to speak from personal experience, some things that have gone into my experience have been even just things that we may initially view as small in our society, little things that parents or caregivers can do during our upbringing that actually have a lasting impact on us. This can be something as small as the way that we refer to other people's bodies. See, I'm someone who struggles with my own identity in my own body, and I notice that a lot of that actually comes from seeing my parents refer to other people. So something like that is just a small thing that we might brush off. We might say that's just how they're talking about someone, that's okay. But in reality, it can have these long-term and devastating effects on someone. And there are so many more things like that.
Yeah. I think what you're saying is really important, even in how people talk about others. Because I know for myself growing up, the way that my parents would talk about each other or other people, it was also a way to see how they think and feel about you, right? If my dad was somebody who's very body conscious and would make a lot of comments about other people's body and very fitness oriented and all sorts of stuff. And while it took a long time before he started making those comments about me, I already knew I need to be on guard because this is going to happen and I need to protect myself from that. And so it even in these indirect ways, like you're saying, are really important to notice and take account of.
Yes, absolutely. Because even if they're referring to someone else and they're saying those things, and even if they never say it to you directly, you know that's how they view people like that, and you begin to internalize that and look upon yourself with their words.
John, what are you seeing in academically with the different ways that people are experiencing ACEs and how that's affecting them?
Yeah, so there has been some conversation about how maybe incomplete the ACEs list that we typically use. I mean, it is kind of very incomplete. And figuring out ways to incorporate things that are, such as peer victimization or bullying, that's not included typically in what we think of as the kind of the ACEs inventory. So it also gets further away from individual level experiences or interpersonal experiences and thinking about how do larger forces play in this, area level or neighborhood safety, sort of thinking about things that we call social determinants of health. So the conditions in which people live, work, play, age, all of these things impact everything we do.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of these invisible hands of health, but they're not. There's something, unfortunately, in the United States, we are way behind in terms of incorporating that into how we view health. We have a very biomedical view of health here, so we're sort of moving more towards understanding these social sorts of factors and how they play out in people's experiences, because they do have very real ramifications for health.
Yeah, that is one of my team's biggest gripes. That's not true. We have a lot of soapboxes that we try not to go on these podcasts. But the fact that we are trying to put mental health and holistic care and how to be a human into this little tiny medical box and be like, see, it does fit when it clearly doesn't. I would even say that you could put that in ACEs, because there's a lot of kids whose parents will take them to the doctor for a tummy ache instead of being like, hey, my kid is having major anxiety or is getting bullied at school and can't do this thing, and they're taking them to the doctor. Well intended, but it's not treating the issue, and it's compounding on the issue, which then, like you're saying, has longer and longer term effects.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks would be surprised how much better people do when we alleviate some of the social things that are causing it. It's not, there's nothing wrong with these young people, these adolescents, these kids. Just like you were saying, going in for tummy ache or some sort of other symptom, right? It's just the way that they're showing it, but it's a natural human way to react to this kind of stress. And so wouldn't it be a better strategy to alleviate the stressor right? Unfortunately, that's a novel concept for our healthcare system here, but I don't want to pile my soapbox into your soapbox.
It's so easy. It sounds so easy when you say it, though. What are the things currently categorized under the ACEs umbrella? Like you mentioned that bullying isn't, which is surprising to hear. But what are the things that aren't under the ACEs umbrella, and what are maybe some of the other things that y'all think should be included if they're not?
Well, off the top of my head, I can remember it's usually an 11 item list that is presented to people. This is usually done in self-report survey form. And they're distilled into, I'm trying to recall, 8 domains. So it includes things like I mentioned before about living with a person who, had a mental illness or maybe was suicidal, to someone who had been incarcerated, someone who had heavy substance use, illicit drug use, exposure to intimate partner violence, emotional abuse, physical abuse. And there are 3 different questions around sexual abuse, but they usually combine those 3 into an exposure to sexual abuse at all, which takes the 11 down to 8.
Okay.
And like I said, bullying, peer victimization is not currently included in that list. There are some inventories that have begun to use them. Some researchers have just kind of said, hey, I'm going to include this in my study. I know this is what we typically do, but I see a need to expand this, and so I'm going to do that. So that literature keeps building.
Cool. Juniper, is there anything that you think should be included in the ACEs considerations that isn't?
I do think that bullying and peer victimization should be included on the questionnaire. There's so many things that also could be included because there's so many things that are all-encompassing as well.
So since we are a queer therapy practice and most of our listeners are of the LGBT community, I know one thing people are curious about is how ACEs affect the queer and trans community differently or specifically, and as people are learning about this and trying to discover if this is something that may affect them or not. Can Juniper, you talk a little bit about how that has affected you and like your queerness and transness?
Yeah, of course. So many mental health issues plague the queer community. We are so much more vulnerable to victimization, direct or indirect. We are much more likely to be struggling with our body image, especially transgender and gender diverse individuals. We are also much more likely to face bullying and victimization from people around us, both online and in the real world, which both can be extremely consequential to someone. And of course, our suicide rates are also much higher than our non-LGBTQIA plus counterparts.
Yeah, which is heartbreaking. And I'm going to keep going back to this bullying thing because it even goes beyond peer bullying. We have a Cheeto that's trying to be president again, and he is famous for bullying the queer community, and especially trans people. And that gets into the zeitgeist and plays into this. And John, I know you study a lot about suicide rates in the queer community, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how or what you're seeing in these long-term effects around that.
Yeah, it's as much as we can do in research, we're also unfortunately really limited in ways because there's a lack of data about sexual orientation and gender identity in most of our surveys in the United States. So federally supported health surveillance surveys only recently started adding questions about sexual orientation. Gender identity is even further behind. So while those the introduction of those data has been an absolute wellspring for researchers who've been trying for a very long time to look at these issues. And for the most part, these very large surveys have echoed what researchers have found from smaller, samples where, they could only sample people from a community center. So we're finding more and more evidence to support this, and we have a lot of studies that show suicidal ideation, suicide attempts are just off the charts for sexual and gender minority youth, and it's important to understand that disparity in its context, because sometimes I feel like it can be, anytime that we do work and trying to find different health outcomes for different groups, they have to be couched in a context, because a lot of times it can be put back onto the people who we're finding these higher rates for. And so it's important to understand that sexual and gender minority people are more likely to be experiencing this type of victimization, which, it helps us to explain why we see these larger differences in the population. But it also, again, back to my earlier point, turns us to look at what is the true determinant here. There's nothing wrong with these young people at all. It's that they are going through these unfair experiences, and that we need to target those experiences. And it's not anything the person brought upon themselves. And I think the thing that in public health is really hard is we look at numbers all day, every day. In fact, in most public health, it's the bigger the number, the better. And so all these numbers and numbers and numbers, but you run the risk of, forgetting there are people behind every single one of these numbers, every single one of them. Why it's so important to balance these conversations and to understand that, okay, this, for instance, this ACEs inventory can get us so far, but there's so much that the community can tell us that you're not getting. You're missing so much. This is great, you can get this, but please expand this. Please look further into these issues, because they're really damaging the health of the community.
And something I also wanted to point out that I think is so important about this campaign is we need more research and more tools and resources for queer people, especially queer youth. And the reason that it's so important that this campaign be accommodating and inclusive to diverse people is so that they feel comfortable sharing their experiences and contributing to more people getting help. Because right now, as it is, being a queer person, just opening up about that at all is extremely daunting and terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just letting that hit for a minute, because I think this is a lot of what myself and our team see in the room is, I'm not just a number. Yes, I have suicide attempts. I have self-harm, coping tools, and all of these things, but it's because of this experience that I have or am going through. And I always go back to, and I'm probably going to butcher this, but like, you're having a really rational response to a very irrational experience, right? And so it's not the suicide attempts, it's not the health, it's not the cutting, it's not all of these things that's the problem. It's what's happening to and around the person that's creating that really causes us to have these coping tools that end up hurting us on top of what's already happening. It's heavy. How do you each sit with this every day? Because this is a lot to experience and it's a lot to work with.
It's a huge weight on me. I pretty often think about all the other gender diverse and trans youth, just like myself, who aren't able to get help, who aren't able to have the same outlet and resources that I am, that allow me to be in this position to help others. I remember when I first heard about Next Benedict, I just cried. And that's a huge weight on me. It's so hard. But it's also a reminder to keep going and to keep trying. I think that we have a current decline going on where trans people and queer people in general are being attacked more and more every day. But I also see so many of us standing up and being willing to defend themselves and to advocate for themselves, and then also being willing to educate others, which they are under no obligation to do.
Are siblings out there that like have the power and the strength to do the education piece, and the activism piece, like you're doing, and the studies behind it, like John, you're doing, are so valuable and so important, especially when there aren't very many of us, and a lot of us are still trying to and need to really hide to stay safe. It's really powerful what you guys are willing to do, and what the campaign is attempting to do. John, how do you sit with this? Because you're looking at a lot of numbers and a lot of lives and a lot of people that are really hurt.
Yeah, it's I've studied suicide now for, I don't know, 15 years or so. So usually the first thing people say is like, oh, that's really sad. I'm like, oh yeah, it is for sure. But for me, it kind of, I guess maybe the simplest way I can put it is it stokes an anger in me that keeps me sort of going. There have been times I just cry in my office. I sit on the LA County Child and Adolescent Suicide Review Team, and that's the easiest way to ruin the third Monday of every month. But there have been times where you just kind of have to take a step back, and it just, out of that sort of that balance between being really sad about what I'm hearing, but also being very angry that people were put in these situations where they didn't see a future where they were in it. And that is not fair to anybody. And so if there's anything, and I kind of learned early on in my training, I'm a behind the scenes person. So I'm not, advocacy, I was like advocacy with numbers. I'm like, the folks who have the eloquence and, the connections and the charisma to do the advocacy, I'm like, y'all just tell me what you need to know, and I'll go find the numbers somewhere. And if they don't exist, we'll do the studies to get the numbers for you. Because, it's so much of these statistics they offend the senses. Suicide rates in this country have gone up for the last generation, 25 years going up. Even though we have a shortage of mental health professionals, we have more mental health professionals and evidence-based treatments now than we've had in our history. And they don't seem to be working, at least in the way that we had hoped that they would be. And my own opinion is that it comes back to these conditions and contexts in which people, their health is formed. And as much as we need to get folks the immediate help for them, and to help manage and process the things that they've been through, we also have got to start attacking the roots of these problems. And these roots are thorny, and they are not easy. And there's a reason why they've probably gone so untended for so long. But this is not something that we can keep. We can't keep them at bay any longer with just thinking we can prescribe away problems, or we've got to really focus on prevention if we're going to help to move the bar on our community's health.
Well said. I'm going to push back on the eloquence or the lack of eloquence you think you have, because that was a really great way to say that. Outside of pivoting a little bit, outside of suicide attempts and self-harm, what are some other health repercussions from ACEs?
They are also highly associated with things like substance use behavior, so heavy substance use behaviors. They can be tied to any number that we've looked at, not we, but the field, the royal we of the field, have looked at premature mortality in general, use of tobacco. There's any number of negative health behaviors or challenging health outcomes. You'd be hard pressed to find one that was not somehow related to ACEs in some way.
I know you mentioned, or maybe it was talked about before we got online, that heart conditions are something that can be connected to the stress and like chronic experience of ACEs. How do you, I know I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here, do you have a general idea of what those rates are? What type of heart conditions pop up?
I am not sure off the top of my head. The literature I'm familiar with is mostly sort of the mortality due to cardiovascular disease, or CVD. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure about the specific sorts of cardiovascular conditions that might be associated. But again, I wouldn't be surprised if you look at, pick one out of a jar. Mm-hmm. And if you were able to know the ACEs history of that sample of folks, I would bet you dollars to donuts that there's going to be a significant association between those.
Yeah. If somebody's listening to this and they're like, oh, a few of these things connect, but that's not me, or my parents loved me, it was fine, or other people had it worse, what would you say to them?
The way that I would respond to someone who isn't owing themselves validation for their potential ACEs is I would advise some self-exploration. Me personally, I've recently been finding out that the voice inside my head that doubts whether or not the people around me enjoy my presence is actually my mother's. And while she didn't have any negative intentions, her language negatively impacted me. Sometimes we are drenched in so much anxiety and negative emotions that we don't know what it's like to feel without those. A normal level of pain is no pain. So I really invite people to just take a deeper look at their own behaviors and what they're inclined towards.
That's going to make me cry. A normal level of pain is no pain. Do you know how many people that thought has never crossed their mind?
As someone who struggles with chronic illness, when I found out your joints weren't supposed to hurt, I was a little bit shocked.
Right?
Yeah.
It's really remarkable how saying something so simple of like, you should just wake up and live your life and not feel like you're batting off all of the voices in your head and that there's potential for that to exist. It's important to say out loud. So now that we've got everybody completely bummed out, what are people going to do about this, right? Like what is the path forward? And like Juniper, you mentioned therapy, and John, you're doing a ton of research to help us understand what's happening. What are some first steps that people can take to learn if this relates to them, begin to explore healing?
I notice that there is so much pressure on queer youth to hold themselves up, to heal themselves, if they could be offered community from people who are like and unlike them, it can be extremely beneficial. It can allow them to feel comfortable in their bodies as themselves. Me personally, being gender nonconforming, if I didn't have the community that allowed me to express myself like this, then I would still be wondering, am I really transgender because I don't want to express myself in a traditionally masculine way, just as an example. And I think that our communities and the people around us can do so much more. We don't just want tolerance, we want inclusivity. We want spaces made for us, not just letting us in.
You're speaking my language. Community is, and we talk about this all the time on the podcast, community is one of the biggest keys to healing, and finding that chosen family and finding those friends and finding those support groups and therapists and all of the things, and jujitsu and all of the things that help us feel connected and empowered and in our body and in ourselves, and that we get a sense to own ourselves versus being subject to the negative voices or the negative experiences owning us, and we're just reacting to those.
Yeah. Me personally, just 2 years ago, I struggled with extreme agoraphobia. I had such bad agoraphobia that quarantine didn't even affect me. I didn't leave the house anyways. It was nothing. I was so uncomfortable just to step outside my door. I could feel my heart drop just opening it. But now I go and do public speaking. Now I can actually go to my local coffee shop and buy a drink. I can talk to people. And I wouldn't have been able to have those skills to do those things had I not had community around me to both help me learn to be myself and learn to be comfortable with myself, and also help me learn the skills to interact with people, especially as a person on the autism spectrum.
What did you start doing? You mentioned that your therapist started kind of pointing this out to you. What are some things that you started doing to help expand?
I personally had a very tough love therapist, which isn't the best option for everybody, but she was very, very adamant about getting me outside. And my whole life, I have been scared of that. It has always been something that I was deeply afraid to do. I've been homeschooled since first grade. I've always been scared to interact with other people my age, and I've always been, confused about social interaction. But she really forced me to take that first step. That's the hardest part. Every sense in your body thinks that it's danger. It thinks that it's bad, especially as a trans person. I go outside and I look at strangers and I wonder what they would think of me, knowing that I am someone who, is transgender and does not conform. But she really pushed me to go to that first youth group, and I met people, and I was able to talk about my interests and see that people were also willing to listen and willing to understand the things I was saying. The people in my life previously hadn't given me the time and the space to express myself in that way. And there's so many youth who are going through ACEs that need to also have a space to be able to express themselves, the things that they're interested in. Like for me, guinea pigs, that was a huge segue into so many other things for me. Just something that small, just someone listening to me talk about guinea pigs was so influential. I went to this youth group where I live, and the first thing I mentioned was guinea pigs. And they weren't telling me to be quiet because it was annoying or unrelated, but they asked questions, they inquired, and it made me feel as though the words I had to say mattered and the knowledge I had mattered. So many queer youth need that. They need to know that they matter, that what they love matters, because that's tied to their person, their being.
Yeah. And not just like what they're saying or what they love, but who they are matter deeply.
Yes.
John, what are you seeing in the research that's helping in ACE's recovery?
Well, one thing that has been there the whole time, that we honestly do not understand very well, for everything we had talked about earlier about how many bad outcomes are associated with ACEs. Those are there in the data, we see that. And oftentimes when people look at, researchers use these data, it will often use it as a count. So how many of the 11 did people experience, right? 1, 2, 3, 4 or more, because we find that once you get 4 or more, the associations are pretty strong, and there's a similarity there in terms of the kind of exposures that people have had. But for one example, we could find that people who have experienced 4 or more ACEs, right? They might be, 35% of them might say that they had thought about killing themselves at some point in time in their life. That's high. That's really high. But that means 35% of them, of people who experienced 4 or more ACEs, said that they had thought of killing themselves. Then that means that the 65% of people who experienced 4 or more ACEs did not think about killing themselves. And we don't understand how that happens, or what sort of resiliency people have. In my own opinion, to be completely Pollyanna about it, is that people are pretty remarkably resilient in ways that just may not be that evident, especially as we were talking about this. It feels like it's this barrage, this constant barrage of things. But I feel like they're, giving people options is so, in my opinion, life-saving. Because for the work I've done in suicide research, I've only seen that bad things happen when people feel like they have no options. And so I think while we don't fully understand resilience, and Juniper, I absolutely adored your story about it can be the smallest kindness. Someone leaning in, someone showing curiosity about something. It is these small things in the world. It doesn't always have to be psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is life-saving for people and necessary. And so is being heard and finding, your group, your community outside of therapy. And so I think that's why the ACEs, Aware campaign is so important in looking at these things that are within reach for people to do, and to notice these things in maybe a different light when they are thinking about, okay, so now I know what ACEs are, and I feel like this might resound with my experience. It's making me think about, where I am currently in my life, but that there are tools and there are strategies and there are things that maybe they've already been doing, right? That has already been part of that, about who they are right now and why they are where they are right now. We can't rewrite our past, but finding different ways of managing that into our future is, I think, what is at the core of this campaign, and that it's not an either or. It is a both and. You can get therapy if you want therapy, if you can in this country afford it and have access to it. And there are other things that could be within your grasp right now. One of the people that I kind of like my nerd idols out there, somewhere in the universe, is a person named Emery Cohen. And he's sort of seen as a founder of community mental health and community psychology. And he wrote a paper, and he very eloquently said, "Help is where you find it." And he was challenging the field to think about, where people find restoration and respite. And while it can be in formal mental health care, which again is life-saving and absolutely should be accessible to folks who need it and want it, it can also be in talking to a barista when you get your hair styled. Especially in my field of public health, thinking about ways in which communities are absolutely integral and part of how health is generated. Health doesn't begin or end at a hospital. Mm-hmm. And so thinking more broadly, and that's why this campaign I think is so important, it makes us think more broadly and changes, I think, or invites us to change how we notice the restorative things that we do for ourselves.
Well said. Again, I'm going to push back on the eloquent thing. But therapy is great. Medicine is great. They are not the answer. Like, as a therapist, I'm nobody's answer. It is what we can do for each other in community. And those, help is where you find it. I love that. Like, the people who stand out in my life are people who would never, especially when I was younger, probably wouldn't even remember me, or is like, oh yeah, that Renae kid. But those moments of connection, that surprise support that comes, is incredibly powerful and healing. So with the Live Beyond campaign that launched just a couple months ago, this will come out in August, and so the campaign launched in May. What are you all hoping that comes with the campaign? What is your plan in continuing to participate with it?
Would you like to go first?
Sure. So, so some of the kind of the next like logistical things, I was going to work on sort of a very short, kind of editorial's the right way, but some sort of written piece just to summarize, ACEs and the LGBTQ plus community. What do we see in research, and where do we kind of see this going, and kind of what is needed, especially. And so that's sort of like the logistics, nuts and bolts thing. I think my hope for it again is thinking about how people can lean into what those two words "live beyond" actually mean to them, and to maybe have realization that they were living beyond for a long time, and maybe didn't call it that, but there's a power in being aware of it now, and continuing on that trajectory, or maybe thinking, you know what, I might need a bit of a detour, or maybe a supplementary path here that can help me out, and they can find it through this campaign.
For me, very similar to what Dr. Blosnich said. People understanding what live beyond means. But of course, this sort of thing takes a long time. It takes time and dedication to reach people. But what I would really like is if this information and these resources could even make a difference in one person's life. If even one person could find the same outlet and the same sort of expression that I did, and make such a 360 recovery, that would be extremely heartwarming to me. So whether it's large scale or small scale, making a difference in someone's life, even just the tiniest, is what I want to get out of this.
And you are such a wonderful inspiration of that, to go from not leaving the house to now jujitsu, scrappling. Is that what it's called?
It's grappling.
Grappling.
Yeah, it's
grappling.
like
Sorry.
Wrestling, but with submissions.
Okay.
Yeah.
That is huge growth, and that is true living, and just incredible. And so I have no doubt that y'all will continue to make an impact as you go on this journey.
Yeah. I recently was an awardee at the Queer Youth Leadership Awards of Santa Cruz County. And at the awards, I wore this big pink prom dress and I wore these big white platform heels. And I went on stage and I told them all, I'm a man. You know, it doesn't matter what I'm wearing or what you see on me and what that makes your brain think. I'm a man. That's how I feel. And I didn't directly see the impact of my words. But afterwards, I had young queer people come to me and tell me that although they identify as transmasculine, although they identify as trans men, they want to go wear dresses now. They want to go do their makeup. They want to practice this form of self-expression. And there's so much of that I don't see. And really, that's what I want, you know, just that difference in someone's life, for them to feel like that, for them to feel that freedom away from that binary. That's a really big part of what I do.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I'm sure those heels were fucking killing it.
They were. I was taller than everyone else on stage.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much for talking with me today. I am just moved, and this conversation is going to stick with me for a while. To end, and like going back to importance of community, we like to hear from both of you about what is a moment in the past like week or two of connection with your own queer communities.
I would say, so actually I was in the Bay Area last weekend visiting a friend, and one thing that I do, much to my partner's chagrin, is that I collect old books. I have a dream of having a room that actually smells like a library, like your elementary school library, because I love that smell. And I went to this bookstore once, and this woman was like, just buy a candle. But it has not deterred me, so I keep going. So I went into a bookshop in the Bay Area and was looking through these shelves, and they had a kind of a queer section, and going through some of these books and realizing how old some of them were, and that just kind of marveling at, these books survived this long, and that thinking about what it was like to, chances are probably not be out, but just be in that time. And that here's this book that, this author is probably long gone. But having that sort of stake to say the community was here. It's been here for a very long time. People have tried to take away signs of it, evidence of it. I think reconnecting the community and sort of maybe not in a here and now, more of like a past way. It's something that,
one of our therapists likes to call the LGBTQ people that have come before our trans sisters, which I just adore.
I love that.
Juniper, what about you?
Well, for me, very similar to what I was just saying a moment ago. Very recently, I went to a jiu-jitsu class, and before we started class, someone came up to me who had just recently started coming to this martial arts school. And she had also been at those Queer Youth Leadership Awards I mentioned. And she works directly with queer youth. She works in schools. And she told me that she overheard a conversation where these two young gender diverse high schoolers were talking about my speech and how I mentioned that, despite being a man, I'm wearing a dress, and just how much it touched them. And it hadn't clicked, the fact that that actually impacted people until then. And it made me feel so accepted in a way. And it made me really recognize these parallels between me and these other people. And I felt my heart was so warmed by this interaction. And the fact that she decided to share this with me too, the fact that even months later, they're still processing it and they're still talking about it means that it probably had an impact on them, and that means something to them. And maybe that can be their glimmer moment, that helps them realize something, that makes them feel accepted. And yeah, it was just really wonderful to hear.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you both. We will have links to connect with the Live Beyond campaign. On their website, there are incredible resources. You can do the screening. There's other people to connect to. There's all sorts of reading. It's really impressive. And so when you're talking about we need more resources, this is a beautiful website to start digging in and getting connected. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. If you're in California and looking for a therapist, visit our website at openspaceptherapycollective.com and book a free intro call with one of our therapists. If you're enjoying My Therapist Is Out, please rate, review, and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. My Therapist Is Out is an Open Space Therapy Collective podcast. Our therapists are Renae Johnson, Kristen Crow, Debbie White, Jenny Nigro, Tara Friedman, Sierra Gruca, and Ernesto Martinez. Our podcast editing is done by Smash and Grab Studio and research and writing done by Matt Wade. We'd love to hear from you about today's topic, so email us at info@openspaceptherapycollective.com. You can find us on TikTok and Instagram at Open Space Therapy Collective. Thanks for listening.